Hey there, art nerds. Today we are talking about a professional grade watercolor made in the US. Today we are talking about M Graham's Watercolor and their gouache. We're going to unbox them, swatch some, put them through the test, and then put them through the field test to see how well these handle as a professional grade watercolor. I know a lot of professional artists really like these watercolors, but what I have to share with you guys today might surprise you. We are doing a two-part review today. It's really going to be multi-part probably, but we have two main things we're looking at. We're taking a look at M Graham's watercolors, and we are also taking a look at M Graham's gouache. Now, the gouache was generously provided to me by M Graham's after talking to them at NAMTA, so thank you so much. The M Graham's watercolors were purchased out of pocket. Some of these are tubes that I have had for a very long, very long time that I've picked up open stock, but I also purchased a 5-color basic set so that I would have colors that should match what M Graham sent me in the gouache. So my hope for today's review is to swatch these while wet, set these up in half pans, and test reactivatability for both, because there are people who use M Graham's gouache as a watercolor. And we're going to do some comparative swatches of the gouache versus the watercolor, just to kind of give you guys an idea for both of them. Now, I will caveat, while I do work with gouache, I'm a watercolor artist primarily, and I'm a watercolor comic artist specifically. I make the comic 7-inch Cara, and my uses for gouache are more for adding details, adding highlights, adding corrections, or if I want a flat matte color, gouache would be the way that I go. So I don't really consider myself a gouache artist, although I do have some experience with gouache. So this is going to be very much from the lens of someone who's experienced with watercolor, but not so much experience with her opaque sister. If you are new to the world of watercolor and gouache, gouache is basically an opaque watercolor. Some brands have a heavier pigment load in their gouache than they do in their watercolor. Some brands will utilize like PW6 or other extenders to make their colors more opaque, and this kind of varies from brand to brand. I believe M Graham's is using a higher pigment load. Now, something that makes M Graham's really interesting as a watercolor is that it is a honey-based watercolor. And this is interesting because my friends who like to paint straight from the tube tend to love this paint. But my friends who like to set it up in half pans often have problems with getting it to dry enough to get it to set up. I'm down here in Southeast Louisiana. It is super humid down here, and honey is hydrophilic. That means it absorbs atmospheric water and holds on to it. It may even be more hydrophilic than the common use, the common binder gum arabic. And man, this bottle is just gotten so dark. So what I'm hoping to do today is to unbox, swatch, compare, set up, and possibly even do a comparative field test. Oh man, this is going to be a long one, with both the M Graham's watercolors and the M Graham's gouache. Now, before we really dive into all of that, I want to let you guys know that long time and material consuming videos like this one are made possible thanks to the generosity of my patrons. You guys can see their names here. I use the funds generated from Patreon to help me purchase the supplies that I'm going to review, and also to help me purchase consumables. So even in a review like this one, where I was sent half of the product that we're going to be talking about, there's still consumables at play. There's going to be a bunch of paper being used. There's going to be ink being used. There is going to be the watercolors that I purchased myself being used, and there's going to be brushes being used. So it's thanks to y'all on Patreon that I'm able to do this. If you can't afford to join me on Patreon just yet, but you'd like to send me a one-time tip, you can send it over to ko-fi.com/natosoup. So coffee.com/natosoup. It is much appreciated, and it really helps me continue to do what I do here on the channel. I did not receive any other compensation from M Grahams other than the gouache that they sent me. I'm under no obligation to do this video, but I want to do this video because I'm curious and you guys are curious, and I was going to do an M Grahams watercolor review. Anyway, actually, I believe I already reviewed M Grahams somewhat a few years ago as part of my professional grade series. So it's a review. It's not a review. It's me kind of, reevaluating my opinions as an artist and seeing how much I've grown. And I'll also be linking that older review, if you guys are curious. I believe that older review also has a big swatch off when I was comparatively swatching like 4 main colors from every brand to see how those vary. I would love to pick up that project again when I've kind of finished amassing all of the professional grade watercolors that I plan to amass. I think that would be a really helpful chart for people. So if you are interested in such a project, let me know down in the comments below that is something that you would like to see. So without too much further ado, let us get started with our M Grahams head-to-head comparison. I'm going to start by unboxing the gouache generously provided by M Grahams. And I'm going to give you guys a little moment of TMI here. So I have started taking Ritalin again for my ADHD. I was on Busbarone, or I am on Busbarone for anxiety, and it slowed me down so much. It made talking hard, it made thinking hard, it made focusing hard, and so we decided it was a good time to resume Ritalin. So I'm kind of liking it. I feel like I'm finally clicking at the pace that I am supposed to be clicking at, but we will see. I have to give it time. But I'm sharing this because a lot of you guys have found me because you also have ADHD. You resonate with my vibe, and I think I'm mentioning this because I am hoping that my vibe is going to go back to its old levels that so many of you guys really liked. Good energy, high energy, here to be an art supply advocate. At least that's my hope. So, just like a little personal note, sharing it with my other neurodivergent buddies. Okay, are you guys ready to see what's inside? I genuinely appreciate the recycled paper. We have 2 cardboard boxes, and then we have a pamphlet with information about their gouache. So let us take a look at the boxes. Okay, so we have Azo Yellow, we have Burnt Sienna, we have Quinacridone Red, and it sounds like 1 tube in here. Hopefully I have these colors so we can do a good head-to-head comparison. And then we have Phthalocyanine Blue Primary. So we almost have, but not quite, a CMYK going on here. And then here is the gouache pamphlet. And a couple of you guys let me know that you liked when I was flipping through the pamphlets from NAMTA. So I am gonna, whoa, it's actually a fold out, okay. So since I am new to their gouache, for the most part, I do actually have a couple of, like your yellow ochre gouache, for example, because it's more opaque than traditional yellow ochres, and it can be good to add like highlights to grass and stuff. So I'm going to read some of this for you guys. Exceptional color begins with a superior vehicle. Our gouache is crafted using honey. You know what? It might be time for a silly voice. Our gouache is crafted using honey, which allows us to load each color with more high-performance, light-fast pigments. The virtue of our fine art gouache is pure color without chalk or adulterants that degrade the appearance of the color when dry. The nature of each pigment creates variations of opacity. We leave the addition of white to the artist. An even matte finish is consistent throughout the entire spectrum. Each color has been formulated with pure Northwest honey for layered application without cracking. Balanced quantities of gum arabic and water are combined with large amounts of pigment to achieve a high degree of flow for strong brushstrokes and direct smooth application without loss of brilliance. While gouache has been used in many forms for hundreds of years, the nature of our color allows for the widest range of versatility from fine art to designer projects. The benefit of using our watercolors. Our watercolors use Northwest honey, allowing us to have higher pigment loads. This provides greater color saturation and richness for a complete range of performance from delicate tints to dark concentrated color. And by color matching both our gouache and watercolor, we allow the artist a wide variety of mixed media options. So this is some technical information here. I cannot keep up that voice. I lived in Nashville for like 7 years, and that voice is, okay, so here in Louisiana, you get people who like adopt what they think is a Cajun accent, but it's really just Gambit from the X-Men, which is not a Cajun accent, it's a fake accent. There were people in Nashville who would adopt that like really twangy fake Southern accent to appear more like country music Southern than they actually were. So that's not meant to be like a real Nashville accent. It's meant to be a mockery of people who are putting on such an accent to fool other people. So not making fun of anybody really. Or I guess I'm making fun of a pastiche. Ooh, so here are the colors in, this is a nice little poster. Hang on a sec. So here is our Azo Yellow, and on here it has the color number, it has the pigment info, the light fast info, and then I am not sure what SO and O means. So, oh, it's opacity, okay? So transparent, semi-transparent, semi-opaque, opaque. Just not used to seeing it in that format. Then we have our Quin Red, then we have our Burnt Sienna, and then we have our Phthalocyanine Blue. So M Graham's gouache line is not the hugest gouache line. Man, I'm going to missay that word at some point. It's not the hugest line of gouache that I have seen. We have 6, 12, 18, 24, 32, and then this is actually 5, so 37 colors it looks like. Hey, double check my math for me, would ya? And the colors in this line are Hansa Yellow, Cadmium Yellow Light, Azo Yellow, Cadmium Yellow, Gamboge, Cadmium Orange, Cadmium Red Light, Naphtha Red, Quinacridone Red, Pyrrole Red, Cadmium Red, Quinacridone Rose, Alizarin Crimson, Quinacridone Violet, Dioxine Purple, Ultramarine Blue, Cobalt Blue, Cerulean Blue, Phthalocyanine Blue, Prussian Blue, Phthalocyanine Green, Viridian, Permanent Green Light, Hooker's Green, Sap Green Permanent, Yellow Ochre, Raw Sienna, Burnt Sienna, Burnt Umber, Raw Umber, Lamp Black, Ivory Black, Payne's Gray, Zinc White, and Titanium White. So now let's unbox this basic set. I ordered this from St. Louis Art Supply a while back. Can you tell I've got a backlog? Can you tell I'm trying to work on it? The artwork is credited, very good, to Ron Stokey, handcrafted in the USA. At M Graham, we believe we have a responsibility to every artist that chooses our color. Our watercolor is made with a time-honored binding medium of natural blackberry honey and pure gum arabic, which gives it extraordinary strength that is easily diluted for smooth, controlled washes and richer color. Honey absorbs moisture from the air, preventing hardening on the palette or in the tube. mgraham.com, and this set contains Azo Yellow, which we have, Permanent Alizarin Crimson, which we didn't get, Ultramarine Blue, Sap Green, and Burnt Sienna. So we do have 2 of the colors that we can compare. This is a slip, ooh, that's nice. A slip style box with our tubes, and these are 15 milliliter tubes. This is the open stock I have amassed over the years, and there may be some duplicates in here because who hasn't crow hoarded a few duplicate watercolor tubes, huh? What's a few duplicates between friends? And I will warn you guys, these tubes, at least when they're in my hands, they do have a tendency to get kind of sticky, leaky, you know, from not properly wiping the tube off before I put it away. Looking at it, I think I have all of the colors that are in this right here. That's super genius of me. Fortunately, these do see use and they do get used up, so they will eventually get used. So the colors I have are Prussian blue, manganese blue hue, ultramarine blue, permanent alizarin crimson, dioxine purple, ultramarine violet deep, mineral violet, azo yellow, sap green, burnt sienna, terra rosa, phthalocyanine green yellow shade, raw. Actually, this is a gouache. See, that's what I mean by I did have a few of their gouaches. Raw umber, burnt umber, bismuth yellow. That brings us to the differences in the two tubes so that you don't buy one mistaking it for the other. Now, the watercolor will have stripes of that color at the top and the bottom. The gouache seems to only have a stripe in the center. It's going to say Artist Watercolor at the top, whereas the gouache just says Artist Gouache. Everything else looks pretty similar. The watercolor will have a series number, so does the gouache. The watercolor has the light fast information, as well as the pigment being used, as well as the vehicle. This is gum arabic. And the gouache has the same thing. Light fast information, pigment being used, vehicle being used. For the gouache test, I'm going to try out something different, and I may work this into all of my testing. While I was at NAMTA, I asked John Cagle at Daniel Smith what they're using as the black background for their swatches, because when I use alcohol marker, sometimes it reactivates and kind of causes this weird color chromatography. And when I use black acrylic ink, it causes a resist when I try to do an opacity test over it. And he told me that they use Daniel Smith's black watercolor ground, and he gave me a pot of it to try out. So I will be talking about Daniel Smith gouache soon and doing a comparison of that as well. So that's something to look forward to. I know a lot of you guys are really into gouache and are curious about how these new introductions to the art supply market hold up and how they swatch and how opaque they are. So I will be talking about that soon, as well as Holbein's Iridori gouache line. But today I thought this was a great opportunity. Now, there is a downside to this. He says, or he told me, that he applies the black ground and then has to allow it to dry for 24 hours before he swatches on top of it. What I am going to do is I am going to create my swatches, and since this is a new addition to how I do watercolor and gouache reviews, I thought I would kind of talk to you guys about it as we do it so you understand where I'm coming from and give it a chance to really dry and focus on the watercolor swatches first. And then tomorrow, not that you guys will notice, but I will give it 24 hours. Tomorrow, I'll come back and do the gouache swatches. All right, so honesty time. I am not a big watercolor ground kind of person, mostly because I find that, like, if I apply it to wood or something, it doesn't really handle like watercolor paper, and I can't really get over that idea. But I think as kind of like our opaque test, it should work really well. How do I want to do this? Like I said, I'm just learning how to do this. So there's going to be some experimentation. I'm sure some of you guys are going to be screaming at me, and we're all just going to have to live with that. I think maybe I want it lower on the paper. I'm using a small pad of Bauhang watercolor paper here, and that is because I don't have that many gouache to swatch. But I have a lot of watercolor to swatch, so I didn't really think they would all necessarily fit on the same pad. Here is our ground. Isn't that pretty? I think it's pretty. It's kind of a warm black, which is nice. And then I'm not really sure if I should have gotten a, you know what, I should, hang on. All right, I went and grabbed a ceramic ramekin for this. That way I can kind of, and if I need to add some water, I can do that. That is a stripe of black. And now I'm like, oh, maybe I should do this for the watercolor as well. Consistency. Now the problem with that is that's going to set me back by at least a day. And I won't have as much free time tomorrow as I will today. But you know what? You only live once. So I'm gonna let these dry, let's be real, overnight. Maybe not 24 hours exactly, but at least 12 hours. All right, we're gonna give them a solid 12 hours of drying, and we will pick up from where we left off tomorrow. Watercolor ground on our watercolor paper has had plenty of time to dry. I really like how nice and matte it is dried. It looks so much better than my alcohol marker. I have our watercolors and I have our gouache sorted out, and I'm still kind of mentally juggling how I want to handle this because we've got some comparisons to do, we've got some potting and half pans to do, and I'm juggling a full workload with stuff I'm not currently showing on YouTube that I'm working on. So it's kind of about finagling the time and figuring out how I want to juggle everything. I think though I am going to start with the gouache. See, part of my concern is I know that gouache, people often prefer to use it while it's still fresh. But for me, as somebody with a cat and cat hair gets everywhere, that isn't as feasible. So for me to use gouache, even if it negatively impacts how the gouache handles as a gouache overall, I'm going to have to pot it, or I'm going to have to store it in a stay fresh, stay wet palette. I don't have any empty stay wet palettes, so we're going to have to pot it into half pans. So I think I'm going to start with potting and swatching the gouache, and then we're going to pot and swatch the watercolor. And then, since I don't have that many of the same colors, I just have azo yellow, quinacridone. No, I don't have the quinacridone. So I only have the two of the same colors, azo yellow and, and burnt sienna. So those are the only two colors that I can do a head-to-head comparison at this time. If you're new here, the way I like to review watercolors and sometimes gouache is to swatch them while they're still wet, while they're still fresh, set them up into half pans as we're doing here, and then let them dry out completely. This is just a plain little tin that I purchased on Amazon with some empty half pans and some sticky magnets on the back. The colors in these half pans are azo yellow spectrum, phthalocyanine blue, quinacridone red, burnt sienna, and raw sienna. I noticed that the gouache is thick and creamy with no separation, and even the raw sienna, which is at least a couple years old, had no separation and it did not solidify in the tube. So if you have a bad problem of your watercolors drying out in your tube before you can use them, M Grahams might be a good solution for that. In mixing these, I'm not just going straight from the tube. I am adding in a little bit of water because I'm going for the consistency of cream / heavy cream. If I were mixing this on a palette, I could be a little bit more precise with that. I may not be applying these as thickly as I normally would for gouache, as there is a good amount of transparency to these watercolors. Some people use M Graham's Gouache as watercolor, so when doing the field test, I may opt to combine the palettes. The gouache seems to become more opaque as it dries, as you guys will see in a moment. This is something that I need to get used to. It's sort of how watercolor dries lighter. And I found that this black ground works really well as an opacity test. There was no reactivation and no smudging. If you're following along at home, I will have full show notes linked down in the description below, as well as abbreviated show notes in the description, and this includes pigment information as well as my thoughts. Also, YouTube does provide a transcript, so if you're having some trouble following along, you can either turn on the captions or you can follow along using the transcript. I know some folks prefer to read in addition to listening. to buy palettes, like Meeden palettes, like the ones you see here, for every watercolor field test that I did, but I have found, this is a recycled Meeden, I poached this from another watercolor set, but in general I have found that buying empty like pencil tins or mint tins off of Amazon is way cheaper, especially for the amount of watercolors I end up reviewing. And I like having them all in their individual sets because it makes it easier for like cross comparison and to pull them out as reference. So the colors that I have at this point in time, in this point in the review, because I did end up buying more, are bismuth yellow, azo yellow, permanent alizarin crimson, dioxine purple, ultramarine violet deep, mineral violet, ultramarine blue, manganese blue hue, Prussian blue, phthalocyanine green yellow shade, sap green, burnt sienna, burnt umber, raw umber, and terra rosa. All of the tubes that you see at this point in the video are older tubes, 1 to honestly like 10 years old. I've had some of these since grad school, so for a while. I noticed that mineral violet, which might be the newest tube, was too hard to pour. I'm gonna show you guys that in a minute. So I tried adding a little bit of hot water just to soften it up. This was the only tube that I really had problems with, but I did see some separation with Terra Rosa. Here's our mineral violet. It does not want to budge. So I soaked it in some hot water and added some hot water, and I was able to get it to loosen up a little bit. It's time to swatch, and as you guys can see, these are still wet. They have not dried out. I noticed that while wet in the half pans, I do have some issues with color control, but that could easily be solved with a ceramic mixing palette. You can see with this blue as well as this green what I mean by some color control issues. It just picked up a little bit too much, and there's a little bit of flocculation there that I'm not sure if it's granulation or if it's just the color wasn't properly mixed. So at the top we have the watercolor, and at the bottom we have the gouache. Not surprisingly, the gouache seems to have more color impact. A little goes a long way. This is particularly noticeable with the azo yellow that both have in common. It seems a bit warmer than the watercolor version, but that might just be the pigment strength. Similar is the burnt sienna, and that would be this over here. And this one here. The gouache is more opaque and seems to have more color to it. This is perhaps due to a higher pigment load in the gouache. I do wish I had more similar colors between the gouache and the watercolors so I could discuss this more in depth. I know that some people will use M Graham Gouache as a watercolor. In fact, I believe James Gurney talks about using it as kind of both. And some of y'all have mentioned that you like the gouache as a watercolor because it's a little bit more economical. You can make it stretch a little bit further, which would be something that I would be interested in maybe playing around with when I do the field test. So now I need to allow both of these to dry out as much as possible because, you know, something I also noticed is these are supposed to be honey based, but all of the tubes that I own of the watercolor say that gum arabic is the vehicle. They don't say gum arabic and honey, they say gum arabic. Now I wonder if they're also mixing in honey, and because it is so heavily advertised as being a honey based watercolor, they don't really feel the need to mention that. Or if some colors are gum arabic based and some colors are gum arabic and honey based, and I just happen not to get any of the ones that contain both honey and gum arabic. And I think I got a pretty fair selection of colors here, kind of spanning the color gamut, but I was a little bit surprised that none of these said that they contained honey on the back with the binder vehicle. So one of the things that is sometimes a problem for people with M Graham's watercolors is that they find that they never fully set up. Some of them stay very liquidy, like dioxine purple tends to stay very liquidy. Some of them will ooze if you store the palette upside down, for example. What I'm going to try to do with these is I'm going to put some desiccator packets in here to dry out as much moisture as possible, and I may try drying them out in a room with a dehydrator to see if we can get them to set up in half pans. Now, I have never had this problem setting the gouache in half pans, and I haven't heard of anybody having this problem. That said, I didn't like Google it or look to see if other people are having that problem with the gouache. So let me know in the comments if you have a problem with the gouache setting up. But as it stands, it seems like the gouache sets up in half pans quite well. And if you prefer to work from half pans like I do, you may find the gouache to be a good alternative to the watercolors for this sort of application. I'm also going to point out that I know that many of you guys prefer to work straight from the tube. I see you. I understand you. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not my preference. And I tend to review things based on how I like to use watercolors. That gives me the fairest review because it's not like I'm fighting myself to make the materials do something that I'm just totally not comfortable with. So the tube watercolors might be a really good fit for people who like to work very immediately with their watercolor and they're looking for that really easy color flow and that freshness. I see you. There's nothing wrong with working with your watercolors straight from the tube or even applying them to a ceramic palette and working with them fresh and also reactivating them when they're dry. All of that is valid. That's just not really what I do here. To prep for the second round of swatches, after the watercolors have fully dried, I'm going to go ahead and apply some more of the ground down because it does take a while to dry out fully, and this will just kind of allow me to get a little bit ahead of the curve. So both of these palettes have had about 5 days to dry. They have dried in a room that gets a lot of air conditioning and it also has the dryer in it. So I was hoping that would help pull out some of the moisture. This is the gouache. The gouache has dried pretty solid. It is also dried, as you guys can see, fairly matte. And there is some cracking, which I believe would be due to the fact that there's more pigment and less humectant in the gouache. These are the watercolors dried in the same room. They were right next to each other. I'm going to touch them and we may get paint on our hands. We're going to see how this goes. They are somewhat glossy for the most part. One color is a little bit matte. Okay, sticky to the touch, but fairly solid. I would not turn this upside down because it will eventually melt. But if you're going to keep it right side up and flat, you should be fine. Same thing. Maybe a little harder, still sticky, tacky, moldable to the touch. Oh, the purple, the dioxine purple, it's still really liquidy. If you had it any bit elevated, it will eventually run down. This one here is a little more solid. This one is pretty solid. It's a lot like the gouache, fairly solid. This one is a lot like the dioxine purple, so it's still very malleable. A little more solid, pretty liquidy. I can touch it and we can see it's a form. This one seemed more solid setup, but I picked up some paint. Like Jello consistency is what we're seeing for a lot of these. And then this one with all of the gum arabic is still pretty tacky and malleable. Now, just because they're tacky and malleable does not mean they're not fairly set up. It doesn't mean that they didn't set up in these half pans, and if you were working at home and you weren't traveling with these and they were always going to stay flat, that it would be an issue. This is why I do use M Grahams in my daily driver palette. I mean, clearly this homunculus is not meant to travel, and this purple that you guys see here is their dioxine purple, and I just refill it. I have not had any issues with it. So in a studio style setting, they will set up enough that you could put them in half pans or that you could leave them in a ceramic palette to dry. But many of you guys have mentioned that you prefer the gouache for this kind of scenario, And so far, I can 100% see why. In fact, these might be more likely, they've shrunk quite a bit, and then this one actually is just loose. I don't know if you guys can see it, just loose. So you might want to put like a dot of gum arabic in the bottom just to keep it in the pan, but in general, these are like really solid in there. So now we're going to test how they re-wet and how they swatch again. We're going to do our color mixing and we're going to do our wet into wet test. And this is a fairly limited selection of gouache colors. I am cognizant of that. I have kind of mixed feelings about it. I would have loved to have gone and picked up like another couple tubes of their gouache, but I am on an art supply diet right now. So I'm not going to be buying anything I don't currently need while I work on reviewing some of the stuff that I've been sitting on for a while. So I may in the future revisit this with a couple of additional colors, probably in another video or maybe during a stream. I'll definitely let you guys know what I think of them if I do end up picking up a couple more tubes. With the gouache, you guys can see I left myself a limited amount of space. So I went ahead and I prepared another. Did it stick? It did stick. Ooh, don't love that with the mass tone. And I had put this on top of this after this had actually fully dried. So that's a little concerning because I did these black swatches a few days after I did these. But I prepared another watercolor sheet of paper for the gouache testing. And then with the watercolor, we have room underneath. I am going to start with our gouache and I'm going to give it a spritz of water to allow it to reactivate and to soak it up, and hopefully we will have better results swatching with this. As you guys saw, I spritzed the gouache with water and allowed it to soak in to reactivate the gouache since it seems pretty dusty and dry. Some of the colors I have in gouache reactivate like a gouache/watercolor hybrid, like the yellow. Some are more like a watercolor, the red, and some are almost as saturated as the gouache was while it was still wet, the burnt and raw siennas. Color control for even coverage is a little easier if working from dry and you don't have a mixing surface. So this could be a good option for folks who want to do plein air with gouache. Coverage is still more opaque than what you would see with some professional grade watercolor brands like Core or Winsor & Newton, but other brands like Turner or Lucas have similar coverage with their watercolor. It really depends on what you like and what you're looking for as an artist. So now that we have swatched the gouache, it's time to move on to re-wetting and re-swatching the watercolor. Over here are the gouache swatches from when the gouache was still wet, and over here are the reconstituted swatches. I noticed in general that color coverage, color mixing, color consistency was a little bit easier for me personally with the reactivated swatches. I realized most of us are going to be working with like a ceramic palette or some other mixing palette to ensure that kind of consistency, but this might be a good option for people who want to do plein air painting, don't want to have to bring a whole lot of mixing surfaces, and want to be able to work with reworkable, rewettable gouache. That's one of the beautiful things about water-based gouache as opposed to acrylic-based gouache, or I guess I should say like gouache as a watercolor format or a water media format versus acrylic gouache, which is really more like a matte acrylic in many instances. So this could be a good option for those of you who want something more portable that you can bring out into the field and isn't going to require you to bring a lot of accessories. I did notice that there is still some opacity to the gouache. Even in this reconstituted form, it does handle a bit more like a watercolor, and some colors are more opaque than others, but really this is kind of consistent with what I've seen from some brands. So some brands are going to be a lot more transparent, like Core Winsor Newton, I found those to be much more transparent, much more translucent, easier to do a multitude of layers, whereas other brands like Turner or like Lucas have a lot more opacity. This kind of falls into that camp. So it really kind of depends on what you're looking for and how much opacity you want to add to your watercolor. Different artists are going to have different working media, different working methods. As a watercolor comic artist and somebody who does illustrations in watercolor that are like generally pictorial and figurative illustrations, I want the ability to do a lot of layers. So sometimes I do want this kind of opacity so I can do some refinement or so I can do certain types of glazes, but I don't necessarily want that unilaterally across the board. So that might be a good reason to introduce a few select gouache colors to your watercolor palette so you can have those more opaque yet still water soluble properties. I'm going to repeat the procedure for the watercolor. I don't actually want to add too much water because I know these will be soupy if I add too much water. So I'm trying to give them just a little light spritz. I'm going to set that over here and we're going to swatch underneath. So I also spritzed the watercolor with water to reactivate them. And I really love how these handle from dry when you reconstitute them. The colors are sometimes a bit more opaque, which is fine with me, but they are so brilliant. They all reconstitute quite well, but I would heavily advise that you allow them to dry fully before putting them away. These might be the ones that folks who have issues with molding, and to be fair, I've never had watercolor mold, but I also never put them away wet. I always leave the top open and allow them to dry up for a couple of days before I put them away. So if you're working with M Grahams and you have molding issues, I would suggest sticking a desiccator packet in there or in the place where you store your paints. For color mixing with the gouache, I can only do a limited amount. I'm going to do yellow, blue, and red. And then for the watercolor, I'm going to focus mainly on mixing primary colors. And really, I just want to demonstrate how well these mix, how easy it is to mix nice secondary colors. When color mixing with gouache, I find that the gouache would benefit from being pre-activated every single time I use them. And in this instance, it only had like an hour to dry out, but it did dry out. So if you want more opaque results, then you need to make sure that they are already pre-moistened so that they're, the pigments are loose and willing to move. Otherwise, unreactivated straight from the half pan, it is surprisingly weak. So for atomic mixing, it was a bit challenging to get solid saturated mixes, but I blame user error. I didn't pre-activate the paint, so I'm going to have to give it another go. It's easier to get more saturated mixes if you pre-activate them, especially with that red, which seems kind of weak for a gouache. As for optical mixing, you can glaze with this gouache, particularly if you're handling it like a watercolor. It didn't seem to reactivate too badly. I'm not demonstrating how colors cover other colors with this mixing test. This is for handling them, or rather, this is handling them like they were watercolor, not necessarily like they were gouache. I realized for color mixing, utilizing only 3, maybe 4, because I did end up mixing in the burnt sienna to try and to make a Payne's gray. I realized it's not really as informative as some of you guys might be looking for. I may decide to do an M Grahams video on their gouache. I may decide to do an M Graham Gouache video as a standalone and kind of pull it aside and kind of work with it more as a gouache than as a watercolor. But I do think you can see some things. You can see that the colors that we didn't pre-activate first, because I did go back and pre-activate them, I thought they still had enough moisture in them because I pre-activated them just an hour ago, but they evaporated quickly. You can see that if you don't pre-activate them, you're going to get some kind of weaker, muddier mixes, whereas if you do pre-activate them, that is right here, these smaller swatches, that's where you're really going to be able to get that color impact and that color payoff. So you do need to treat these with respect. And we are able to do some glazing and optical blending. Again, I'm not handling these like I would or like one would handle a gouache in this instance. I'm handling them pretty similarly to how I handle watercolor, since I know a lot of you guys do use these as a watercolor. So that's kind of the basis that I'm judging these on. So next, let's do some color mixing with their watercolors. So with the watercolors, I find that you don't need to pre-activate them. Even after drying, they just need a little touch of water. What's on your brush is probably good enough. You do definitely need a mixing surface with these, as they pick up a lot of paint and they are very saturated colors. I didn't do the optical blending test here because we're going to do a field test, and I'm going to kind of play around with that a lot more when it comes to the field test. No problems with color mixing with the watercolors, but y'all should be aware you do not need to pre-activate these. You do need to pre-activate these like every time, whether it's been like even 10 minutes. You can see how they're starting to look dry. Pre-activate them if you're still going to paint with them. With these, you do not need to pre-activate them. They are really hydrophilic, so any amount of water on the brush will already start to pick up the color, and you are definitely going to want a mixing surface to help with that color control. We were able to get several really nice secondary colors, and I chose not to do a optical blending test like we did with the gouache. We're going to find that information out when we do the field test anyway. So next, it's time to do the wet into wet test, and that means I need another pad of cotton rag watercolor paper, and I'm going to be using both the watercolors and the gouache for this because I want to see how well they play together and if there are any issues I should know about before I commit to the field test. For the wet into wet test, I used both watercolor and gouache. The watercolor disperses a lot. It probably contains more oxgall than the gouache. There is a lot of diffusion with the watercolor. Now, I love diffusion. I love this kind of misty blending, so that is not a problem for me. The gouache doesn't disperse nearly as much. It may contain less oxgall. So if you don't like your watercolors moving all over the place, the gouache might be a better fit. While it dries, I'm going to keep an eye out for haloing and overfading as well as granulation. So my notes from after it had fully dried, I saw no noticeable haloing, but I am noticing a weird, almost dye-like effect with the red gouache. I'm not particularly fond of this color, and when I pick up more gouache, I'll probably go for an alizarin crimson instead of a quin red. Most colors diffused out quite a bit, but you can see some speckles of pigment with some of the gouaches. Our wet into to wet test has dried. We used both watercolor and gouache on this. I wanted to try out a few different techniques and to really see how compatible they are. I don't notice any real haloing, but I am noticing like a weird dye-like effect with the red gouache. I'm not particularly fond of this color, and when I go to pick up more gouache, I'll probably go for an alizarin crimson instead of a quin red. Most of the colors diffuse out quite a bit, as you guys could see in the hyperlapse, but you can see some speckles of pigment with the gouache. And realistically, a gouache isn't really meant to diffuse out this much, so I would say that's pretty forgivable. Finally, we're going to do the lift test. I'm going to start with the watercolors, and I'm going to swatch both of the straight from the tubes that have had a chance to dry for about a week, and then the dried in the tubes painted today, which have had a chance to dry for a few hours. With the watercolor, all of the colors have some lift, but none are entirely lifting. The ultramarine violet and mineral violet are both pretty lifting, probably because they are so granulating. I'm going to repeat the same test on the gouache swatches. So up here are the swatches we did about 5 days ago, straight from the tube while the paint is still wet. And then down here are the swatches that we did today with the paint that had dried in half pans. The gouache, all of the colors are pretty lifting. I would be interested in seeing how these handle as a gouache, or if they lift and muddy as you add on more layers. The gouache, I noticed that both are pretty lifting as well, with the fresher swatches being a bit more lifting. You can see more color lifted up as compared to the swatches that I did about 5 days ago. Now, this is a little bit concerning to me if you were to use these as a gouache, because I know a lot of people switch over to acrylic gouache because they don't want that reactivation, they don't want that muddiness, they don't want it to lift. And I'd be a little bit worried about these reactivating, muddying, and lifting. So here are my preliminary thoughts on the M Graham Gouache and the M Graham watercolors. And keep in mind, I am still going to field test these. And also keep in mind that I really don't have a lot of the gouache and not enough overlapping colors. So you may want to take what I have to say with a dash of salt. Gouache painters who have experience with this brand or just want to share your knowledge of gouache down in the comments, please feel free to do so. So the gouache, even when used like watercolor, is a bit more opaque and maybe a bit more lifting than the watercolor. So this might be a good addition to your watercolor kit if you're looking for, say, a more opaque yellow ochre or a more opaque burnt sienna or stronger yellows that won't get as diluted when you mix them. However, I find they mix a little more weakly than the watercolor and would hesitate to use just M Graham's gouache as a watercolor personally, as I'd have to keep rewetting the palette rather than just activating it at the start of the painting session. That said, it sets up very nicely in half pans and it doesn't turn soupy, so it may be a great addition for travel painters who wish to use M Graham's. Their watercolor mixes are more saturated and they mix more cleanly, but it does not need activation at all, so it can quickly turn to soup if you pre-activate it or if you add too much water to your half pans. Some colors never fully dry out or harden like our dioxine purple, so this is a good option for studio painters who don't intend to take the palette anywhere and can store it horizontally. It's also a good option for painters who like the convenience of half pans, but they don't want to wait for their colors to wake up. They want to be able to paint immediately, as these wake up very quickly. The watercolors themselves remind me a bit of the Metairie blue watercolors that we talked about multiple times here on the channel. picked up one more tube of gouache and 2 of watercolor just to round things out. For the gouache, I picked up ultramarine blue because can't imagine not having a good warm blue to work with. And also I wanted to compare the two, the gouache and the watercolor. I picked up yellow ochre in watercolor because I paint with yellow ochre all the time. And I picked up cadmium red because I was looking for a warm red, and this is a cooler red. And y'all, I have to admit, cadmium red is really expensive. Oh boy. Normally I just get like scarlet hue, much cheaper. But M Graham's doesn't actually have as wide a range of watercolors as you might think they do. So I kind of had to work with what my local store, David's Art Supply in Metairie, Louisiana, had to offer. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and pot these. These have been drying for at least a week, but I'm in the middle of working on a commission right now, so I can't get back to these just yet. But I did think it would be a good time to just kind of slip in there maybe and add in some additional colors. So these are magneted in the palette. I'm just going to scoot these over to make room. Add that cadmium in right there, and then do the same thing down here with the neutrals. And then as for up here, really I'd love to put it between the yellow and the red, but I think the way this is going to have to go is going to be more like this. Anybody else like really particular about how you organize your colors in palettes? And does it drive you nuts if things end up not in your normal order? Just me? Now for a little quick swatching. So I want to do a little comparison swatch. So this is the ultramarine blue in watercolor. A nice, fairly clean ultramarine blue, not overly yellow from the gum arabic. Now I'm going to swatch the gouache while it's still wet. And it does seem to have a higher pigment load than the watercolor, since we're able to get a much richer color, but we are working from a dry and from a wet, so that could be part of what's going on. And then I'll swatch our watercolors. Ooh, picked up a little too much of the yellow ochre. This isn't gouache, it's watercolor. Come on, Becca. It's one of the reasons I prefer to work with dry watercolors, is it results in less waste on my part. Then after I clean out my brush, I'll pick out a little bit of our cadmium red. Generally I avoid working with cadmiums, not just because they're expensive, but they are toxic. All right, give those a chance to dry and we'll see how they turn out. Before I take you into hyperlapse though, I do want to point out M Graham's has this kind of distinctive smell that some people might find bothering. To me, it kind of smells like wet dirt after a rain, so I like the smell, but it is a distinct smell and it might bother some people, and I've mostly noticed it with M Graham's. Now, having used some of M Graham's browns over the years, I actually have some fondness associated with this smell. So, you know, take what you will of that. But I did think it was worth pointing out, since I know a lot of you guys do have sensitivities. So as of right now, and it's not really a fair assessment because all things are not even, I think the ultramarine blue in the gouache is nicer than the ultramarine blue in the watercolor. If I could afford to do a full head-to-head comparison or just get my hands on samples, I would love to try that, because I have a feeling the gouache is probably the better value. And I know some of you guys have said that, starting to kind of come along to your side, especially if the only difference between the gouache and the watercolor is pigment load. Then for people who like rich saturated color, a little might go a long way if you go with the gouache. So I'm going to pop this back in my drying room, which happens to be my laundry room, and I will check back with you guys once these have had a chance to dry out. I've purchased several colors since starting this video, and I wanted to re-swatch all of them and make a swatch map before I start the field test, so we know where everything is at, particularly because M Grahams has a lot of colors that in mass tone don't really reflect the color itself. So it's important to have these swatches on hand so we can make good color choices. I've mentioned before that I've used M Grahams as part of my daily driver palette regularly, so I'm familiar with these watercolors and I really like them. I've never used them exclusively though, so this is my first time getting a straightforward look at how they handle on their own. These are easy to activate, easy to blend out, the colors don't get totally lost in extreme dilution. So I am creating kind of a glowy background effect with the window. The window is going to be the primary source of light, so I really wanted to diffuse some of the colors, like the color of the wall and some of the yellows in the window. And I found that this was very easy to do with M Graham watercolors. I'm also using a ceramic palette just to kind of help with color control. I'm also doing a similar effect on the ground below their feet. So this is Kara and Meldina, two of the main characters from my comic 7-inch Kara. This is a comic that takes place in a dollhouse, and Meldina is trying to teach Kara to sew because she's hoping she can make Kara her apprentice just like she was her own mother's apprentice. And sewing for Meldina is a lucrative business. She's well known in the area for her designs and for her ability, and she's hoping to pass that along to Kara, who really struggles with sewing. Not only is she just not good at it, but she finds it really tedious and boring. This is kind of like a little minor plot throughout the story, but I think it's a really good look at Kara's personality. She is a really outgoing, gregarious girl who likes to spend her time outside, and she's very busy. If you'd like to learn more about these characters, you can read the webcomic at 7inchkara.com, or you can order your own copy of Volume 1 and Volume 2, both of which are in full watercolor. They are watercolor graphic novels in the Natto shop at nattosoup.com/shop. So I found that it's very easy to get these kind of light, airy, beautiful, diffused colors. These work really well in dilution, which is something that we haven't seen with too many of the watercolors we've talked about here on the channel. It is a common trait with professional grade watercolors, but we've talked a lot about watercolors that would like to pretend they're professional grade and they're not, or they are student grade and they're trying to charge professional grade prices. M Grahams are quite pricey, as we've talked about several times, but this is another brand where a little can really go a long way, and you're not going to be constantly refilling your half pan if that's how you choose to use them. I found that it was easy to mix the skin tones for these characters. It's easy to mix a shadow skin tone, and M Grahams has kind of an earthy smell to it, as I mentioned earlier. I really like this, but it might bother you. There is some granulation in there, but it's pretty fine, so it's easy to mix colors for smaller shapes like tiny faces. And this is something, as a watercolor comic artist, I'm always looking at and I'm always considering. There have been brands that I really like, but the way they granulate just doesn't work for the kind of art that I do. Speaking of, this is painted on Arches watercolor paper, which has become the standard for my field test since I got a new printer, and Stonehenge Aqua just doesn't quite work as well for me. I'm also noticing that these seem to reconstitute and remix quite well. The skin tone and the Payne's Gray mix in particular. And I did mix my own Payne's Gray for this so that, because I didn't buy one, and it can make a beautiful Payne's Gray.
Looking at this review, I am reminded that I've actually used footage from this review here in a tutorial on grise, blouillet, and brunier underpainting techniques. That'll be coming out to you guys at some point. I've already shared it on Patreon, so if you're interested in learning those underpainting techniques from me, you can join me at patreon.com/nattasoup and get early access to them. Otherwise, you're just gonna have to wait for it like everybody else. One of the things I did notice is that it's been difficult to build up shading on Meldina's purple. It might be the magnesium purple or the cobalt purple on her sweater. It's kind of the nature of this pigment though. This is a more opaque pigment that's more meant as like a finishing color than as an initial color, which is why I did a blue wash with it. I've been using M Grahams for years, so I figured that this would be an easy one. I figured this would be a knockout of the park. I figured I could say only good things about it, but I'm finding that on their own, as a standalone palette, I'm not a huge fan. They're expensive, and yes, they do deliver brilliant color, but they can be challenging to build up, and they have a tendency to reactivate and lift. While they do set up nicely in half pans, they have a tendency to stay wet and tacky. So if you have molding issues with watercolors, I imagine these might cause problems, despite them causing honey, which is antifungal and antibacterial. That isn't to say, though, that I dislike M Grahams or that I'm not recommending that you have it in your palette. I think what I am recommending is that if you are a watercolor portrait artist, a watercolor comic artist, if you paint tiny cute things like I do, M Grahams definitely has a place in my Daily Driver palette. Several of my favorite colors, including their burnt umber, are in my Daily Driver color palette. I also use their dioxine purple because it's this really rich, sort of grape colored purple. It's really pretty. But the entirety of my palette isn't M Grahams. That wouldn't be really sustainable or feasible for me financially, nor does it really work as a whole for what I'm trying to do. I do think this is a high quality watercolor set that a lot of artists would really enjoy, but I think if you are an illustrator like I am, and I think several of you guys might be, that you might want to pick and choose which colors you like from M Grahams. I, to my knowledge, don't think that they have an official dot card set. So what I would recommend you do is find a friend who's got some M Grahams, get them to send you some dots, and just kind of work your way around the watercolor community, trading and exchanging dots so you can see what colors you like and what colors are a good fit for your palette. Though I did have some complaints and some points that I wanted to share with you guys. I really enjoyed painting this illustration. It was wonderful to spend time with Kara and Meldina. And actually, this illustration isn't from 7-inch Kara. It's from my other series, Lilliputian Living, which is a charming prose and world building series of 2 books. I'm finishing up the 2nd book now. I'm so excited about that. And this is one of the illustrations from the month where I did fashion and textile exploration. So if you guys are into tiny life, if you're into world building, if you're into charming black and white illustrations, I hope you guys will check out Lilliputian Living. It is my yearly October inking challenge that I share just about everywhere. And at the time of me narrating it, I am in the thick of it. I am in the middle of it. These have enough opacity that I did need to do a little bit of re-inking just to kind of re-establish the contrast balance and the light balance since this started out as an inked illustration. So if you're looking for some watercolors that have some oomph and some body, these might be it. I would love to field test the gouache as watercolor, but I don't have enough to do that right now. So I am waiting till I have amassed enough that I can go back and do a gouache field test and get back to you guys with my thoughts on those as well. I am sure those are going to be even more opaque than these. At the time of recording, this original watercolor illustration is available for purchase. If you'd like to own it for yourself, you can contact me at becca.hilburn@gmail.com.
Normally when we're wrapping things up, I would have all the swatches and the wet into wet for you guys. In the time between when I did those and when I painted this, Joseph cleaned up the studio for me and I really appreciate it, but I genuinely have no idea where those swatches have gone off to. And to be fair to me, this review has kind of gone on for several weeks now, so it's time to wrap things up. So you'll just have to use your imagination for that. But now that we have finished the field test, it's right here, come on, it's time to talk about the pros and cons of M Graham's watercolors. And I'm going to lump the gouache in with the watercolors, mostly because I am primarily a watercolor artist, and I may revisit the gouache as its own thing and compare it against other brands' gouaches sometime in the future. So let's start with the pros. M Graham's delivers brilliant color. They are quick to activate because the honey that they use as part of their binder is hydrophilic, so it'll really suck in that water. And it is very easy to mix brilliant secondary colors. The cons, though, is I actually struggle to get some colors saturated or dark enough. And I'm not sure if it's me, I'm not sure if it's the color selection that I've put together or what, but I was kind of struggling. These are also fairly expensive watercolor paints, and part of that might be because they are made in the US, and when you buy M Grahams, you are supporting a US created product, and those are often a little bit more expensive. So you may find that the increase in price is well justified by all the benefits. But for me, as a watercolor comic artist who uses a lot of watercolors and uses a lot of convenience colors, this is a little rich for my blood to use exclusively. So what about my verdict? I know a lot of artists love M Grahams. I do too. They're easy to activate, they're smooth with buttery color, and they have some great neutrals. M Grahams definitely has a place in my daily driver palette, but I wouldn't recommend exclusively using M Grahams as there's great, more affordable professional watercolor options out there as well. Of course, that is just my opinion based on what you guys, my audience, have told me about your paint needs and your paint preferences, and different artists have different needs and are going to feel differently. I know that James Gurney loves M Graham watercolors, so if you're looking for another opinion on these watercolors, you ought to check out his channel. A lot of you guys said that you actually prefer to use the M Graham's gouache in lieu of a watercolor. You find the pigment load to be higher, so it stretches further for you. I didn't have enough of the gouache and I didn't feel like spending a lot of extra money to find out. I didn't have enough of the gouache to put them to their own field test to see how that would hold up. But if I ever should amass that much of their gouache, I would love to try it out. Or maybe I'll take what I have with me on a trip at some point and try to do a little bit of landscape painting. I definitely believe you guys. I just want to see if it would be a good fit for me and the kind of art that I like to make. All in all, while I like M Graham's watercolors, and they will probably always have a place in my daily driver palette, I do think they are kind of expensive for what you get, and I couldn't justify having an entire large mega palette like I do full of M Grahams. It's just too expensive for that, and there's some much cheaper alternatives that either stretch a little bit further, like I find Pore stretches a little bit further for me, or they are just more affordable like PWC. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. What kind of art do you make? What do you use watercolor for? And whether or not you find M Grahams to fit all of your needs, you don't need any other brands, or if you're like me and you love having a little bit of everything in your palette because everything has a different purpose. All of your colors are selected for specific qualities, for the specific kind of art that you make. I love hearing back from you guys, even when we come to this from very different viewpoints and we leave from this with very different conclusions. I hope you guys found this helpful, useful, and informative. Thank you to M Grahams for sending me some of your watercolor and gouache to try out. I also purchased a lot and already owned a lot on my own to put together this palette here. I did feel like this palette that I have here, the one I used for the field test, should have been able to meet all of my basic watercolor needs. I have a lot of neutrals, I've got some good greens, I've got a lot of good mixing colors, and I was really surprised that I kept feeling like there were more colors that I needed. I really feel like this should have been able to cover the gamut for a simple watercolor like this, especially because I selected a lot of the browns to suit these characters specifically since they're from my webcomic. So a lot of where I'm coming from is from using a palette of this size, which I actually don't know how many colors is this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So this is a 22 color palette. This should have been able to meet my needs very adequately. I mean, working with an 18 to 24 color palette is usually very easy for me. I know I use that big mega palette for a lot of my painting, but it's just for convenience. It's a lot of pre-mixed colors that I already like. So I was really surprised that I struggled to mix the sort of colors that I was looking for, struggled to get the kind of saturation and the kind of color layering that I was looking for with this. So a lot of my kind of revised opinions about M Graham and how it fits into my work as a watercolor artist came from using these colors, many of which I selected myself specifically for this illustration and this illustration. So I'm really curious to hear about your experiences and what kind of art you make. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I hope it was helpful, useful, and informative. Hopefully reviews like this one help you guys make art a habit. It is my goal to help you demystify what art supplies will work for you or will not work for you. Coming at this from a watercolor comic artist and illustrator's lens, I think I have something unique to bring to the table. So I'm always interested in hearing other people's opinions, how they use these things, what they like these things for, and what they might recommend instead. So if you have another favorite brand that you prefer, let me know that as well. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Reviews like this were made possible thanks to my patrons. Thank you guys so much. You guys will see their names here.